to chair this session. I want to welcome all of you to this discussion of the administration's Afghanistan and South Asia strategy as announced by the President a couple of weeks ago. I'm especially honored to have this very distinguished panel. I've known each of the members for a very long time. It's been an honor to have worked with General Allen in Iraq, and I visited him also when he was the commander of our and allied forces in Afghanistan, a man of great distinction. And of course, I think I got involved in Afghanistan maybe because of the gentleman to my left and as ambassador. Ambassador Dobbins, I've learned a lot from him over the years. I've served with distinction in our diplomacy in so many difficult places and some nice places as well. And Tom Graham was, of course, a distinguished colleague from the Bush administration, and was a great policy person and analyst of the former Soviet Union, for sure, and Russia now. And what we're going to do is to introduce a subject, which I'll do. Just will take a minute or two, and then General Allen will speak, and then Ambassador Dobbins, and then Tom, and we'll then open it up to questions. Of course, as I said, the President announced after several months of deliberation and discussion and debate and a comprehensive review, from what I understand, of issues related to the conflict in Afghanistan, which has been going on for a very long time, a new strategy. I think the key features of which, as I gathered, listening to the President, were that we were not going to abandon Afghanistan. That was, at least that option was put off, taken off the table. And the lines of commitment or objectives or directions was the no timetable, some increase in forces without specifying numbers, a greater role in terms of cooperating with India in Afghanistan, greater emphasis about the issue of sanctuaries by the President, more in Pakistan. There was a new agreement with the Afghan government, although he did not speak a lot about it in his speech, about the steps that the Afghans will take in exchange for to the commitment that we were making, and a greater delegation of authorities to the commander. Again, there was not a great deal that the President said in that. So the issues really are, I may have left one or two things out, but the question is, these were general directions, the details to be worked out. The President talked about integrating the various instruments, how that will happen, besides the details of each of the pillars. And the implementation, which is also always very important, how it would be implemented, would be appropriately resourced or not, and then whether what effects will it have, even if all of those things are dealt with appropriately, which is always has to be approached with a question mark, and what will it have the intended effects, or what would be the unintended consequences of some of the steps or elements of the strategy that was described. One aspect that was not talked about, and Tom will talk about that, is the question is there was a lot of conversation about India, even more about Pakistan, but some of the other nearby countries with interest and involvement in Afghanistan was not discussed. The issue of Iran, the issue of Russia, China, but we'll talk about that, particularly Russia, and there have been reports and discussions in the media that the Russians may be helping the Taliban. As to, we will discuss that as well. With that said, I'd like to now turn to John Allen. Sure. For his perspective, and I said then we go to Jim and to Tom. John, please.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's great to be with you and Jim and Tom. It's always a pleasure to be at a session like this and to see so many old friends and some new friends. I'll just say that I have known the ambassador for some time. We were reminiscing a few minutes ago that I may have been, in his long and distinguished career, the only Marine or any brigadier general put at the position of attention in front of his desk in the middle of a war zone to explain myself on an issue. I won't tell you why, because I think we're on the record, but it was a distinctive moment for me, and I didn't know whether I was going to recover from that day. You know, we've had a substantial change, I think, in the direction that we were headed with respect to Afghanistan, and I'll make several points. And I think we'll come back to a number of these in the course of additional comments, but also in the Q&A as well. When I watched the process of the development of this strategy over time, and I think everyone in here was either a participant or was certainly able to read the press reports on it. It was a bit of a turbulent process for this administration, to include, not the least of which being evidently some concern about whether the president was going to pull out entirely. I've been to the zero option abyss before. It doesn't look good. And whether he was going to relieve the commander in Afghanistan as well. And we knew that as we were hearing these kinds of stray voltage out of the sit room, that we were in a pretty delicate moment. But I was very glad that the president in his speech said that he didn't follow his instincts. I think we all are conscious of his instincts on many things, but in this case, his instincts on Afghanistan were, as he put it very clearly, to pull out initially. To the great credit, I think, of the key members of his national security team, he's got a pretty good national security team, between H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis, and my guess would be with some horizontal input from John Kelly. He came to a conclusion which I think is at this moment probably as good as we're going to get. And let me just make the first point. The first point is that he made the decision. He changed his mind. That's really a key development for him and his presidency and this administration, because if we had gone with his instinct, we'd be in a different place, number one. Number two, he has lifted an end date as the means by which we'll be conducting the operations with resolute support, but the American involvement in it. You know, when I was the commander there, and it's ancient history at this point, when you go from 140,000 plus troops in less than 40 months based on more than 800 facilities to less than 10,000 troops on 12 facilities, you just can't imagine that we're going to find anything other than just rank chaos in the aftermath. And the fact that with that small American force, some big chunk of which was engaged solely in counterterror operations, that we aren't in a worse position, frankly, in Afghanistan than we actually are. And I think it speaks very highly to the troops that were left behind, our European partners who helped us, but also, frankly, because I did spend a lot of time in the field with the Afghan forces. You know, the Afghans are trying to get off their knees and get on their feet as a credible security and police force in Afghanistan. And they've taken a lot of casualties, and they've had some very serious setbacks, but I think on the whole, we could see some change in that as a result of the president's decisions. First and foremost, then, the decision to remove an end date and to move to a conditions-based departure is very important. It's important for a variety of reasons. It's important because it gives confidence to the Afghan people who are desperately looking for some measure or signal of American commitment. It's very important, I think, to our European partners who still have their troops on the ground and have, in fact, because we've asked them, increase the numbers of their troops on the ground. And it's a very important signal to them. As I think many of you know, beyond the U.S. involvement in an economic level, the European Union is deeply involved in assisting Afghanistan's economy to get on its feet. It's a very important message to the Afghan National Security Forces, and that is we're going to stay with them. We're going to be advising them, we're going to be assisting them, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a very important message to Pakistan, which has been, if nothing, one of the great hedging entities within the region. And for a whole variety of reasons, was unlikely to commit one direction or the other with respect to its long-term strategy, as long as there was the very real intent, or very real prospect the United States was going to pull out on a date certain, and ultimately our European partners would almost certainly follow us as well. And then, of course, it's a very important signal to the Taliban. So I applaud the fact that we have gone to a conditions-based departure. And what's important for us all is, I think, for the administration and through the Department of Defense to bring us into line with what those conditions are going to be, and what we'll consider by the United States as being the conditions under which we could begin to reduce that force. But I don't see that happening for some period of time. I also applaud the ability for the Secretary of Defense to moderate the numbers of troops that are on the ground. And what's important, I think, to understand is that, we see a number, 3,500 or so, or 3,900, it depends on how you're counting and what kinds of forces are going in. The number is really much less important than the capabilities that those forces will have. It's not just going to be advisors, it's not just going to be those who are seeking to provide assistance and training, but there'll be some other firepower capabilities that'll go in as well. So it's much more about the kinds of forces that are going in than necessarily the numbers themselves. And then, of course, what's very important to understand is that what we don't want to see is the U.S. military strategy or our allied strategy talked about or conceived of in isolation from what I think are the other two critical aspects of the overall strategy for the United States, and that is, what are we going to do to continue to support the development of institutions within the Afghan government. I know the President doesn't like the term nation building, but there's a big difference between nation building and capacity building, and I think we have lots of opportunity for capacity building. And what are we going to do to continue the process of seeking to get the economy on its feet? The combination of those three elements, the security platform, which, as I understand how these troops will ultimately augment the ones that are on the ground today, the security platform, the greater assistance to the Afghan National Security Forces and the police, creates the environment within which then a greater assistance can be brought to bear for the capacity building within the government, and ultimately economic capacity building as well. So in the context of security and advising and assisting, what's very important, and what we have sought to do for a long period of time, and as a direct result of decisions that were made in 2012 and 2013, we sought to touch as much of the Afghan National Security Forces as we could. Ultimately, to have a presence in the Corps headquarters and to have advisors and advisory elements as necessary, being able to go forward on operations with those forces that were committed. For that purpose, we thought we needed I didn't think I knew, I needed 13,600 American troops and another 6,000 or so non-U.S. NATO and partner forces. About 20,000, and we thought we could cover all 6 corps and have additional capability at what we were calling a national training center, probably in Kandahar, co-located with the 215th Corps, with the idea that while we would be located in the Corps headquarters and while we would go out as advisors for brigade-level operations, there would be a constant training package going on at the National Training Center, whereby elements of the corps would be flown in to Kandahar from around the country and constantly trained and retrained and retrained to go back to their areas to benefit from the combat staff training that we would be giving them in both firepower and maneuver. When we didn't get more than about 9,000, and that number was on a 2-year glide slope to depart, several things happened. First of all, we had to lift up off the surface area of the Afghans in broad terms, and also not just lift up off the entire surface area, but lift up in terms of the level at which we could touch the Afghans. And so almost from the very beginning, the difficulty associated with providing the persistent presence that we wanted. We called it the pervasive touch. We had very substantial difficulty with the pervasive touch, and it was magnified and exacerbated probably the difficulty by the 2-year deadline, frankly, that we were going to start to begin to pull out. So it was two things. It was a difficult tactical mission that was virtually impossible in terms of having that pervasive touch and being with the Afghans around the country to help them as they were getting on their feet and being able to extend their security capabilities. But about the time that they were going to be able to do that, about the time that Ashraf Ghani and I had talked about the Afghan economy becoming recognizable in the aftermath of so many years of wartime distortion, which would be about 2017, now we were going to be pulling out entirely. It was just a whole series and a confluence of decisions that would have made this process very difficult. So look, we haven't solved the problem. We've got a lot of challenges ahead of us. But one of the first challenges we had was we were too few and we were too short in time. And if we've been able to solve those two things with these decisions, and I would frankly contend that we have the finest commander we could get in Afghanistan right now. There are a few people that have been on the ground more frequently in Afghanistan and been more deeply involved in various aspects of the war and the campaign than General Mick Nicholson. And we also have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs who commanded the war. We have a Secretary of Defense who has a bit of experience in all of this, and we have a great national security advisor. So I think that we are poised with those conditions to bring stability to that support platform that I talked about at the beginning. That's that security stability platform, upon which then thereafter, with the right kind of other whole of government engagement and whole of nations engagement, we can continue to work very closely with Ashraf Ghani to increase his governmental capacity to get after the issues of corruption. We have got to get after corruption in the Afghan piece. We've got to help him in this, and I believe he's committed to it. I think he's made some progress in it, but it isn't the Taliban, frankly, that in the end are the great threat to us in Afghanistan. It is the corruption that ultimately we have to deal with. And we can't do any of that if we don't have a secure platform, security platform from which then the president and the CEO can govern, ultimately setting the conditions for economic progress. All three of those are inextricably linked. They're all symbiotic. So with that, Mr. Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Dobbins, Jim.
Thank you. Well, you're not going to find too much differences between John, Sal, and I, among other things, because the three of us, along with some other colleagues and former colleagues, produced a paper last year which pretty much recommended what the president has actually decided. And the president's decision was very much a mainline national security establishment decision. And I say this having participated in the decision in 2014 that President Obama made. And what Trump has decided this year is what Obama was being urged to decide back in 2014, which is a number, something along the lines of the number that John mentioned and that we're now moving toward, and an open-ended commitment beyond that. State Defense, General Dunford, who was then commander in the field, were agreed. The president wasn't. The president was determined to end our commitment to Afghanistan, our military commitment in Afghanistan, by the end of his term of office. He therefore cut the number lower than what Dunford was recommending in 2014, said that he was going to cut it in half again in 2015, and that it was going to be down to 0 by the end of 2016. Now, 3 weeks after he announced that decision, the Islamic State burst out of Syria and marched to the gates of Baghdad. And this was bad news for Iraq, but it was good news for Afghanistan, because I was convinced at that point that Obama, being a responsible president, even if wrong in this particular situation, was not going to repeat the mistake he made in 2011, and that he would not carry out his announced decision to withdraw, as turned out to be the case, but leave the decision to his successor. Again, last year, the three of us, along with, I think, nearly all of the former commanders, Petraeus, McChrystal, and all of the other former commanders, nearly all of the former ambassadors, Crocker, you, and a number of others, and all of the still living special representatives for Afghanistan, Pakistan, issued a paper which, again, was broadly consistent with what the president has decided. Now, there were certain Trumpian flourishes to the president's announcement, which I'll deal with. I mean, first of all, he said that that our objective is victory, but he defined victory in very interesting terms. Victory was destroying Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, but it was just, quote, preventing the Taliban from taking over Afghanistan. That was the definition of victory. He said we're not going to do nation building, but we are going to continue our economic and security assistance programs. Now, both President Bush and President Obama said they weren't doing nation building either. So I think all three of them really object to the term rather than the actual activities that are involved. And so, again, there's an element of continuity there despite the Trumpian flourish. He said that we weren't going to tell the Afghans how to run their country, but that we were conditioning our assistance on them making a number of reforms. Again, you can draw your own conclusions. Finally, he referred somewhat skeptically to the possibility of a peace settlement. And in the following day, the Secretary of State, and I think the Secretary of Defense too, in less detail, elaborated on this quite significantly and put the search for reconciliation, as it's called in the Afghan context, a peace agreement with the Taliban, as the centerpiece of our diplomatic strategy for the region. Now, in part, I think this was because the State Department and the Defense Department recognized that we're not going to retain the commitment of our European allies unless this remains the centerpiece of our diplomatic and political strategy for the region. But it's also implicit in what the president announced, which was we're going to stay there until we have victory, and victory is preventing the Taliban from taking over the country. Well, you know, that really gives you only one exit strategy, and the exit strategy is some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, in the paper that the three of us and a number of others put out last year, we were, like Trump, somewhat skeptical that a peace settlement was around the corner. And I continue to be less optimistic than some of my former colleagues currently in the State Department on the topic. But I do think it's an objective worth retaining, worth working for, even if one assumes that it's fairly distant into the future. And it's certainly not going to become a viable operational objective until the decline in the government's control and fortunes is reversed, and until you do establish a durable and enduring stalemate, which seemed to be what the president was proposing to do, although he, in Trumpian terms, characterized it as a victory. And as General Allen said, I think this is as good as it gets, not only given the current views within the administration, but in the country in general. And so I'm quite satisfied with the decision, and think that we will see a modest and slow improvement in the government and in the government's fortunes and the security situation over the next year or two.
Thank you very much, Jim. Tom?
Yes, thank you very much, Sal. I'll be very brief and start out with one basic point. Russia never likes to be left out of the discussion. And that's the one thing that they probably object to. And if you look at Putin over the past 16 or 17 years, his basic thrust has been to reassert Russia's role as a great power. That means we have a seat at the table at all the big international issues, whether they be in Europe, Asia, or Afghanistan, even if our interests might not be as deeply involved as some of the other countries. A little history. Russia has never been comfortable with the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Back at in the 2000s, the Bush administration, they were willing to accept that because of deep concern about the Taliban, the terrorist threat in Afghanistan, and the way that was spilling over, or had spilled over into Central Asia, which is really the clear focal point of Russian strategy in the region. So the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, some of the problems that had in Uzbekistan at that time, Putin thought that the United States would be able to provide the type of military capability that would reduce that threat significantly. And he was willing, in order to get that, to make the payoff of allowing a greater American presence in Central Asia, actually overruling many of his own national security advisors in making that decision in 2001. I think the Russians were basically happy with what the United States was doing in the initial phases. It had ups and downs. But more recently, I think the situation has changed significantly from the Russian standpoint. And they see less of a need for a major U.S. role in Afghanistan, and certainly not in Central Asia. First, despite the U.S. presence over the past 15 years, they haven't dealt with, from the Russian standpoint, we haven't dealt with what they see as one of the primary challenges in addition to terrorism, and that is narcotics. The poppy cultivation has grown several times over the past 10 or 15 years. Narcotics and opium is a big problem in Russia now. Initially, the opium would flow through Russia into markets in Europe. But one of the perverse consequences of the rising standard of living in Russia is now Russia has become the end market for much of the opium that goes through the northern route. And given the demographic and public health problems that Russia has, this is a major concern. And as we know, there's been tremendous difficulty in working with us on the narcotics side. We never being able to or willing to undertake the massive eradication campaign that the Russians wanted to do, because we were dealing with a whole different set of issues and primary issues in Afghanistan. Second, the nature of the terrorist problem has changed. From the Russian standpoint, it really has shifted from Afghanistan to the Middle East, Syria in particular. If you look at the number of Russian-speaking fighters, they're on the Syrian battlefield. That's what the main focus is. If they're concerned about Afghanistan, it is the emerging ISIS presence in Afghanistan that gives them concern, much more so than the Taliban. In fact, because of the struggle between the Taliban and ISIS over tactics and leadership of various terrorist groups in that part of the world, the Russians have tilted toward the Taliban. And it's sort of ironic now to see the Russians who were complaining about our support for the Taliban in the 1990s. Zal will remember this, I think, in particular. Now aiding the Taliban in various ways, both to deal with ISIS, but also, I think, to continue to create some problems on the ground for the Afghan central government and obviously for the United States as well. Now, I think where the Russians have concluded is that there's very little upside to the American presence in Afghanistan at this point. If they aid the Taliban, if this pot keeps stirring, perhaps there's some advantage in keeping the United States bogged down in a war that the Russians are convinced the United States can't win. But they're also trying to do things that complicate any diplomatic efforts in building their own solution to the Afghan problem. And this is consistent with the way they've approached a number of other crises, is that they're trying to get the regional powers together without the United States, without the Europeans, to work on negotiating some sort of solution, a power-sharing arrangement. So earlier this year, in April, the Russians gather in Moscow the Central Asian states, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Iranians, the Indians, to talk about a solution for Afghanistan. Much in the same way that in Syria, when they can't deal with the United States, you bring the Turks and the Iranians together to try to develop a solution or a negotiating package for that part of the world. That's an effort that will continue. I think the Russians believe that over time that will lead to results. They don't believe the United States has the staying power, that eventually we will tire of this. It's not in our neighborhood. It is in their neighborhood. They have no place to go. The regional powers that they're gathering together have no place to go. And eventually, these are the powers that are going to determine the outcome of Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future. Now, it may turn out that the Chinese get more out of this than the Russians do, but that's a secondary point for the Russians at this point. The focus is more on the relationship with the United States, and I think their keen desire to make sure that the United States has a waning presence in Central Asia in particular, but more broadly along Russia's periphery.
Thank you very much, Tom. Excellent points. And now we'll open it to questions, comments. Please raise your hand. We'll start with you, Paul. Yeah, here.
I'm Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. And General Allen, you're obviously completely right that the President changed his mind and went against his instincts. To what extent are you and others concerned that if he can change his mind once, he can change his mind twice? How committed is he, in other words, to this policy, which he himself admitted goes against his own instincts?
Well, I don't think anyone in this room certainly could tell us what's on his mind. He's certainly his own person. But I think we've all come to recognize that what motivates this president is both the appearance and the fact of being successful. He liked to use the term during the campaign of being a winner, and I think it was pretty clear to him once he was exposed to the realities of Afghanistan that pulling out was not only not going to make him a winner, it was going to paint him probably with the ultimate failure of the war effort, breaking faith with the American people who'd already sacrificed so much, and it would be hung around his neck as the president who lost Afghanistan. So if you're sort of going in with that as the premise that this president both wants to deliver success and wants to appear to be successful, listening to his national security team and being attentive to their advice got us this decision. And my sense would be that, as we will always do, any president, whether it's President Bush or President Obama, now President Trump, there will be the periodic assessment of the success of the campaign and what other resources are needed, what other resources might be removed, likely not going to be removed anytime soon. But so short answer is I don't know whether he's going to change his mind or not. But if we believe fundamentally that this president both wants to win this war, to have victory, as Jim said, and to appear to have been the one who reversed the course on what I think was not a very good trajectory, frankly, he needs to stay this course. And as long as he's got folks like Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster and Joe Dunford and John Kelly whispering in his ear on some of the realities that we're facing in that region and in that conflict, I think we'll probably stay the course. That's the best I can do for you at this point.
Thanks. Barbara?
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. General Allen, pleasure to see
Hi,
you
Barbara.
again.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Let me ask about both Iran and Pakistan and their role in this, and how you think the Trump administration's increased bellicosity toward Iran will impact the situation in Afghanistan. And of course, the president has also been very harshly critical of Pakistan as well. The two countries who seem most pivotal in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan. What would be the impact if the U.S. withdraws from the JCPOA, for example, on Afghanistan and the Iranian role there, which has been quite large? Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, you want to take that?
Yeah. Well, on Iran, I believe the president didn't even mention Iran in his statement. After Pakistan, Iran is certainly the next most influential country in Afghanistan, considerably more influential, I think, than Russia. Its current attitude is parallel to what we're seeing with Russia. That is, historically, since 2001, Iran and Russia have supported the regime in Kabul, and were Zarif and Kabulov were pals and partners of ours at the Bonn conference in 2001, and Zal and I worked very effectively with them. And we're somewhat disconcerted when we found that our friend had been put on the axis of evil 3 weeks later. Thanks for the help. But recently, both Iran and Russia, while continuing on balance to support the regime, are also playing footsie with the Taliban and having contacts and even providing some degree of support. I think Tom has mentioned some of the reasons for this. I think another reason is the nature of their relationship with the United States and its deterioration. I was still in government when their behavior in the Ukraine occurred, and although the Russians and we didn't cut off contact on Afghanistan, and both of us, and my Russian interlocutor said Putin had specifically exempted Afghanistan from the list of issues they weren't going to deal with Washington on, and we had done the same. Nevertheless, there was a significant decline in their willingness to work with us, and so I think that tensions in that relationship have been a factor in their behavior. I think this is also probably the principal factor in the Iranian behavior. That is, they're signaling that they have other options, and that they could be a lot more unhelpful if they wanted to be, and in effect signaling that Afghanistan would be one of the points where they would react to any kind of American military action against them. Now, in terms of the hopes for a reconciliation prospect, I think it's necessary to include Iran, Russia, Pakistan in the process of promoting a peace process, establishing a peace forum, and undoubtedly participating in some respect in those negotiations. And until we face up to that, we're not going to make much progress. Now, actually, the Russians and I agreed jointly to set up the regional group that Tom mentioned. At that point, it included the United States, and we had a couple of meetings with Pakistan, India, Iran, the United States, Afghanistan, and Russia. And I think it was after I left that we switched and went to a form that excluded the Russians. So it was China, Pakistan, the United States, and Afghanistan, which we thought might be more productive in producing the Taliban at the table, and it came close. But that miffed the Russians, and that's another reason why they decided to set up a group that didn't have the United States, in direct response to our setting up one that didn't have Russia. So I think that's my answer on your question.
Tom, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I mean, I think Jim's absolutely right. Obviously, the deterioration in the U.S.-Russian relationship is another factor behind the Russians' actions in Afghanistan. They still want to talk about Afghanistan, but they want to talk about Afghanistan along with a number of other things that they want to talk to the United States about.
Sure.
Could I add as well?
Oh, please.
Thanks, Barbara. It's great to see you. Thanks for the question. There was a comment that was made when I was in Afghanistan that said if you really want to understand the Persian influence in Afghanistan, draw a circle around everyone that celebrates Nowruz. And you have a sense of the ancient Persian-Afghan connectivity. And what was clear to me after a very short time in country was that while the Iranians have capacity for really substantial mischief in the roughly the western third of the country, from Uruzgan and Khur province west, they were quite restrained, even when Ahmadinejad was the president. And I think it's worth remembering that until Ahmadinejad was the president, Iran was one of the largest foreign donors in Afghanistan. So, if we're looking for ways, I think, to find intersection of opportunities to talk to the Iranians on issues not associated with the nuclear issue and the JCPOA, here's an opportunity. Here is this president new to office, with a new strategy. The government's already certified compliance with the JICPOA once. The chances are he'll probably find it again. The alternative is going to be pretty hard on him in this town if he tries to decertify our role in it. And the Iranians on any given day in Afghanistan are hugely important to food security and energy security along that entire border. And just about every year on time, the Iranians threaten to drive 500,000 Afghan refugees back across the border and create an enormous crisis. So there's all kinds of deep cultural, human relationships along the Iranian border, which I think we should look at in terms of opportunity. Opportunity to support the Afghans in ways that we should. And Tom talked about Russia. Here's another opportunity. We've got a lot of friction points with the Russians right now, and it's easy to grind up against them in the Donbass or along the eastern flank of NATO or in Syria or in Libya. There's lots of opportunity for us to grind up against the Russians. Of course, the influence campaign in the United States. But if we can find a place where we do have intersecting interests, it might be here. And I can remember on a number of occasions in Anbar, the old sheikhs would always accuse me of being inherently English. And there were a couple of valleys I found myself in Afghanistan where they accused me of being Soviet. So I think that there's real opportunity here for us to find a means where we could find common interest or common needs or means to talk. And the other 2 points I would make, and I don't have a response for it, but I've always believed that we ought to do all we can to bring the Chinese into Afghanistan as much as we can. They were actually pretty good partners when I was there. They didn't have the security necessary to do some of the work that they wanted to do, but on occasion where we were able to harmonize our efforts and our forces were able ultimately to create the conditions by which they could go in and do surveys, et cetera, actually quite a good partnership. And I think that there's another opportunity for us and the Chinese to find common cause there. I'm less sanguine about the relationship with Pakistan, frankly.
Please. And then you.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Christina Wong, Breitbart News. There's no timeline for a troop departure, but what are the conditions that should determine troop departure? This is for General Allen. And NATO support has been critical in Afghanistan. Should they be doing more? Can they be doing more?
Thank you.
Or for anyone else who'd like to answer.
Thank you. Jim, you want to go first? Give John a minute.
Sure.
to-
Well, I think NATO allies have signaled they're prepared to do a little bit more as a result of our willingness to do a little bit more. So I think you'll see NATO numbers going up modestly alongside U.S. numbers. On the conditions for departure, I mean, the president was pretty explicit about that in a way that doesn't really answer your question, which is that we're there until we win, and winning consists of obliterating Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, which is a defined end state, and preventing the Taliban from taking over the Afghan government. So the answer is there isn't. And then the State Department has specifically said that that in seeking to create in seeking to blunt Taliban advances, the intent is to promote a peace settlement. And so logically, if you put these things together, the conditions for departure is a peace settlement.
Right. John?
Sure, and how we get there, I think, is not something that has been revealed to any of us yet. And I'm not being cynical at all on this. I think what's important right now is for any commander in an environment like this, it is to have an assessment process that is both subjective and objective. And while I've not seen it, but my very strong suspicion is it exists, if Mick Nicholson were in here today and we were all cleared to the level of classification, I think he could probably lay out for you a series of objectives over time that he seeks to achieve. And probably they're regionally oriented, not nationwide necessarily. He'll want to make progress in certain areas first. and be willing to set other areas in the country off farther in the distance. But the key for your answer is the assessment process that he's going to use ultimately to measure over time whether they're accomplishing their objectives. I think Jim's detailed that well. But my guess would be that it will be the X number of provinces in the country. He'll be looking to attempt to continue to measure who's in control. And this is a key point. If you don't know how to measure who's in control at a particular spot on the ground in Afghanistan, you don't know whether your security mechanisms or efforts are actually working. And you can be fooled if you're not careful on actually who's in control. So for him now, because we don't have 145,000 troops, and we don't have advisors with every unit down to the battalion Kandak level, being able to work closely with the Afghans and constantly be dialoguing with them so that we understand who's actually in control down at the village level will give him some sense about whether we've been able to extend Afghan control over the ground. You probably are aware that there was not an insignificant number of occasions where the CIA would publish their periodic reports which talked about district by district how many were Afghan, how many were Taliban, how many were contested. And we weren't always in agreement. You might be surprised to learn that. We weren't always in agreement on the findings. But my guess would be that as the Afghans are able to establish control with American advisors, and in some cases American firepower, we'll see some of that turn around. And probably Mick has got a map somewhere in his war room where he can point to it at any given day and say, this amount of Afghan ground controlled by Afghan national security forces is in fact in the hands of the Afghans. And there'll be other measures as well.
Thanks. Please. Excuse me, over here.
I'm probably loud enough I don't need the mic. Kelly Jane Torrance, The Weekly Standard. I hope you'll forgive me, but I have two questions. One is a follow-up, if I may, on the Iran question earlier. And I'm wondering why do we think that we might have common interests with Iran and Afghanistan? It seems, and the idea that they would be a force for stability in that country, because it seems pretty clear that an unstable Afghanistan is to Iran's interest, and they are doing their best to continue helping that country be unstable right now with their aid to the Taliban, and by doing so also hitting the United States. So why do we think that they would change, and what common interests do we have with them there?
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I'm not sure that that in Tehran they would love to have an unstable Afghanistan, frankly, or would want an unstable Afghanistan. For a very long time, we believed that the Afghans or the Iranians were willing to have a relatively weak central government that was aligned with the West, that wasn't inherently inimical to Tehran. So once again, in the West, I had the capacity to communicate with the Iranians through a variety of ways, and I was very clear to them that if I saw 122 millimeter rockets, if I saw explosively formed projectiles, or if I saw man-pads, then I would treat them and their agents in a very different way. And I never saw any of that. But I did see open borders routinely. I saw the Iranians working to help to stabilize provincial governments, et cetera, in their own way in terms of supporting people I was supporting. And they weren't our friends by any stretch of the imagination, and they probably still aren't our friends in so many ways. But something else to remember, and Tom talked about the drug problem that the Russians are suffering from. The Iranians suffer from a terrible drug problem as well, and we believed all along that there was an opportunity for us to find common interest, if for that reason alone.
No, it's part of the problem, though, that you have, Revolutionary Guards that are profiting off that as well. So you've got within the government itself, you've got some different.
Well, we do. It's very difficult for us to have a relationship with Iran, I think, under Ahmadinejad. But I believe that under Rouhani and Zarif, we have different players there. And of course, the supreme leader, Khamenei, is always going to be the supreme leader, and in the end, he's going to have the final say. But I don't believe necessarily that Iran, given the fact that our numbers are actually so small there, where they may have been motivated in the past to try to just bleed us by virtue of our surface area on the ground, I'm not so sure that it's in their interest, or they view that it's in their interest to have an inherently unstable Afghanistan.
Well, I
on the
assume
eastern
instability
flank.
gives them more influence in the country. But sorry,
Thank you.
I'll stop.
But they have a lot of influence in the country already,
Right.
and I think we've been able to work with it and through it.
Well, so my next question.
Let me
sorry.
add something
Very
on,
quick.
on Iran.
I promise.
Yeah.
You know, at the height of the Afghan Civil War in the 90s, the Iranians hosted 3 million Afghan refugees, most of whom have been able to go home. They don't want 3 million refugees. You know, we're getting upset here because we get 50,000 and we're going to reduce it next year. Can you imagine getting a country a third the size of the United States getting 3 million of them coming across the border? So they have a very dramatic interest in a stable, peaceful Afghanistan.
So the other quick question.
Yeah.
So on talking about, we should bring China into the discussion, Russia, all these players, and talking about having a peace process. I guess my question is, do the Afghan people want the Taliban to be part of a peace process and part of the government, given the way that the Taliban treated civilians when they were in power, and given the fact that the Taliban is against democracy, against elections? How do the Afghan people feel? We're sort of talking about, we want China part of this, we want Russia. Well, what about the Afghan people? Should we worry that we're helping hand over their country to be ruled by people they don't want to be ruled by?
Well, Zal, you probably have a feel for this as well. I mean, it's a controversial issue in Afghanistan, but virtually the entire political class has endorsed reconciliation. Now, how quickly you move to it, what kind of concessions you'd be prepared to make, what kind of role you'd be given. The Taliban, none of those things have been defined, and it would become more controversial as you move there. But they had an election back in 2014. There were, I think, 11 candidates or 12 candidates, and all of them endorsed both a continued American presence and reconciliation as the objective, that is, a peace process with the Taliban. So I think they thought that this was a vote getter.
Thank you. Over there, and then, yeah, please. FT.
Thanks. Katrina Manson, Financial Times. Thank you. General Allen, you said you were less sanguine about the relationship with Pakistan, and I wondered, in the light of the more harsh and public stance that this administration has taken, how you see that playing in terms of responses in the medium term from Pakistan, and how the Trump administration might sequence its increasing sense that it can get more harsh and more public, and what will happen in private.
Okay. Anybody else want to take a crack at that while I'm formulating my thoughts? Yes. I've been present in a number of meetings over the last several years where American officials have just been exasperated with the incapacity to change Pakistani behavior. And my own public view on this issue has been we need to remember that we've had long and deep relations with the Pakistanis. And at an individual level, at a human-to-human level, we still have, I think, pretty good relations with the Pakistani people. There were occasions when I felt I was able to cooperate pretty significantly and effectively across the border, the Durand line, with Pakistani leadership. I was very frustrated over the Haqqanis. We had that conversation in Islamabad and Rawalpindi on a number of occasions. And I also have been clear that we got to be careful as a nation that our reflex with respect to Pakistan is inherently punitive. Pakistan is a very delicate democracy. I think we've only had one peaceful transition of power from one democratically elected government to another, and I'm not sure, frankly, what we got there now, given the recent changes in leadership. But that's a good trend, but it's a very delicate democracy, and there's a lot of corruption, and there are enormous economic problems, although there have been some improvements of late. And so I think we need to be careful in our relationship with Pakistan that it's always the stick and seldom the carrot. But I think the frustration that many of our presidents have had is they've not been able to divine what the carrot looks like sufficiently to gain the kind of cooperation from the Pakistanis that we would all want to see in Afghanistan. And I don't know whether that is now, conceivably, with this president saying we're going to stay till we win, that this might be the certainty that the Pakistanis have seemed to want, that the United States isn't going to cut and run, and the Pakistanis need to have a card to play in what would inherently be the collapse of Afghanistan in the aftermath of the departure. So part of that, I think, is their having confidence that we're going to stay. Part of it is, of course, our willingness to continue an operation or a relationship with them that helps them solidify their own stability. I mean, there are enormous numbers of foreign terrorist organizations, relatively speaking, in Pakistan that are both oriented outward to both India and to Afghanistan, but also inwardly in terms of insurgency movements in virtually every one of the Pakistani provinces. So I think that there's opportunities for us to work with Pakistan in that regard. But the one thing I think Pakistan needs to understand, and it's happening now, and it's probably the worst outcome that they could want, and that is we're going to start to work around Pakistan with India. And do we want to do that at the expense of Pakistan and the inherent sense by the Pakistanis that this process will ultimately encircle them and create a vulnerability in their strategic rear that they would never want to see happen? I don't know. The foreign minister from Afghanistan just had a very productive meeting with the prime minister in India. And that outcome, I think, doesn't bode well ultimately, or won't be perceived as boding well in Islamabad or Rawalpindi. So I think there's real opportunities for us with this president's stance, his decisions, to gain cooperation with Pakistan. But I know that the frustration of the previous presidents before President Trump has been, we don't know what combination of measures, sticks and carrots, friendships, economic relations, etc., can change Pakistani behavior, because it hasn't in the past. And when I gave up command ultimately and I briefed our president on what I believed were the great challenges, I thought that with the right kinds of the posturing of Afghan troops and the right advisory presence that we would have and the kind of firepower that the coalition could continue to provide to the Afghans, we could protect Afghanistan ultimately from the safe havens in Pakistan. It would be a hard fight, it would be difficult over time, but Pakistan was not going to be the reason that Afghanistan was going to collapse. And I think we could do that if necessary.
Thank you.
Zal, can I just add?
Oh, please, anytime.
Just a minor point.
Yeah, you wanna
We've
add?
got to talk about Russia at some point. Interestingly, one of the few things in Trump's speech that the Russians did criticize was his criticism of Pakistan.
Right.
And what they've tried to do over the past couple of years is to exploit the tensions in the American-Pakistani relationship for their own benefit. I think part of it is working with the Pakistan in support of the Taliban to some extent. I think they're also trying to get leverage over New Delhi, in part because of the growing relationship between India and the United States. I don't think this is going to be a major factor in the politics, but it is another way where the Russians think that they can play on the problems that we may have created for ourselves.
Jim, you want to?
You know, during my time, our relations with Pakistan on this issue actually regressed. My first interlocutor was General Kiani, the head of the army, and he was fairly candid. He said, you know, we have a lot of enemies, and Taliban doesn't rank very high among them. And I can't afford to go after the lower ranked ones until I've dealt successfully with the higher ranked ones, which is essentially the Pakistani Taliban. And that was fairly candid. He was succeeded by General Sharif, and I got a different line which sounded better but turned out to be worse. And his line was, we're going to treat all militants equally. And the problem with this is that you can't negotiate with somebody who says he agrees with you when he doesn't. You know, you say something, he says, yes, I agree, we'll do that. And then you don't. That's the end of the conversation. It doesn't go anywhere. And so frustrated as I was with Kiani, I was even more frustrated with Sharif. I do think that Kiani was probably close to explaining the real rationale for Pakistani passivity. At one point, they saw the Taliban as an asset. Now I think the Afghan Taliban as an asset. Now I think they see them primarily as a potential enemy and one they can't afford to antagonize.
Thanks, Jim.
And let me add to that. General Kiani was very concerned, to Jim's point, about antagonizing the Taliban, the TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, antagonizing the Taliban in such a way that major operations would begin to break out in the settled areas, the Punjab. Very concerned about that. So he walked a very fine balance, frankly, between helping us, and he did help us in the tribal areas to some extent. And frankly, when his units would get ambushed by the TTP, I provided air weapons teams and close air support along the border to try to reduce the pressure on them. So those were days when we actually could cooperate. But the other, I think, really important point is that the Pakistani military is not as strong as it used to be. Its resources have been cut back dramatically, and the environment in which a lot of the Pakistani army exists in the tribal areas is a very austere expeditionary environment compared to how they operated along the LOC. And the last point I'll make is that we also in the West, I think, frequently don't appreciate the numbers of casualties the Pakistanis are suffering. The troops are suffering every single day fighting real militants, which are just tribal militants, not necessarily ideologically aligned militants, but just tribal militants in that very difficult area. So it's not as though Pakistan is just sitting east of the border unmolested by this. They've got a lot of internal problems as well as cross-border problems that they're trying to deal with much less capability than they did just 10 years ago.
Jacob, and then we'll come.
My question is very simple. The panel's discussion is pretty bleak as far as the future in Afghanistan is concerned. If you were Trump listening to this, I think you might ask the question, are we going to be in Afghanistan for another 16 years, having this same discussion in 16 years, where we're simply holding the line? Is that what we're condemned to? There's not going to be any real progress, but we're going to avert the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think we will be there 16 years. But I don't think that this is a 16-year loss on our part. You know, remember, we made some really profound decisions to go from 140,000 troops to 9,500 in about 18 months. And our surface area was so small, and the amount of time that we left for ourselves to accomplish the mission, which was to train and professionalize the Afghan military, I mean, we did it to ourselves. So President Trump has basically removed the end date and has given us an end state. He's given us some more capability. He's encouraging our allies to get involved. And I don't believe necessarily that after 16 years, and as I know you're aware, as most of the people in this room are, after a long insurgency, it's not about winning the war, it's about winning the peace. And when you short sheet the peace, which is what we did by a whole variety of decisions that we made to begin on 1 January 2015, I don't know how we could expect that we'd be anywhere else than where we are today. It was the resources that we needed that would have set us up to have a very different conversation today if we'd had the 20,000 or more troops that we needed. And that's all water under the bridge, and I don't want to second guess the president. As Jim said, this president was you know, a very circumspect guy. But we made decisions that ultimately have us arriving where we are today. And if we'd have the comprehensive effort that I hope we'll have, with this president committed to an outcome that, whatever he calls winning, is in comports with what Mick Nicholson and Jim Mattis believe is winning, then I think we can hold the line at a security level to let the other two aspects, very important aspects, which is greater capacity in governance and greater capacity in economic development. If we can get those two going while we're holding the line at a security level, I think we've got a chance. But if we had continued on the trajectory we're on, we'd have lost the security line, which would have meant we'd have no hope for governmental and economic capacity. So we may well be there 16 more years. We've had troops in Kosovo for a very long time. We've had troops in the Sinai for a generation. And Americans haven't really noticed that either. And I'm not proposing that the American troops deployed overseas in hostile environment is ever insignificant. But the point is, you have to win the peace. And we made decisions that set us on a course where we weren't going to win the peace. And I think this president has changed that.
Perfect. There was one here, and then we come here. Was there someone over there? Yeah, right there. Sorry.
My question was asked by
Okay, great,
Financial Times.
great. Oh, thank you. Go ahead. Here, over. Yeah. Yes, please. Over here. Yeah. Sorry, I don't recognize everyone, but I'll come to you. You'll be last, because we're running out of time. Yeah.
Given what General Allen, what you just said, like that we might be there in 16 years,
what is the ultimate goal? What is the actual strategy here? And also, what's the point? I mean, if we're going to just be here indefinitely, is there an actual end point to this, or does this go on forever and ever and ever?
That's a great question. How many years have we been in Korea? How many years have we been in Japan? How many years have we been in Europe? The point was we won those pieces. And in South Korea, if you do the history, South Korean democracy didn't really begin to emerge out of massive corruption until the latter part of the 70s. And so if having a force of American troops there, 13, 15,000, for some number of time, which could be moderated over time, gives the Afghans the capacity to be a functioning government, not necessarily a democracy as we know it necessarily, but can get its economy underway, as opposed to ultimately being witness to the collapse of this organization, ultimately the reestablishment of the Taliban, which we know, because of the presence of the Islamic State in that region, we know that there'll be a host to a Salafi jihadist platform of some form or another. I think the alternatives are just obvious in this regard. So I don't want to see us there for 16 years doing security measures and nothing else. You know, the whole point of the president's decision was this creates the security platform upon which then the other two legs of this triangle have to be worked. And it has to be worked consciously. It has to be worked as part of the campaign. And that's building governmental capacity and dealing with corruption and getting the economy online again. And if we're not doing all those three things, then your point's a good one. Let's get out of there. But in those occasions where we have stayed for generations overseas, we won the peace. And frankly, when you look around the world at functioning democracies, some of the very best ones are the ones where American presence over the long term after a war stabilized the situation to permit the emergence of governance and economic capacity.
Thank you, John. I'll do this since we're running out of time. I'll take 4 quick questions and then let the panel respond to them. Go first with you, and then Josh here, and of course, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Chuck Pena with Defense Priorities, and for the record, I've been arguing strategically we need to get out of Afghanistan since about the middle of the first term of the Obama administration, just so the panel has some perspective on my question. I'm a little concerned about this notion of winning and having to obliterate ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It seems like we're playing right into the radical Islamist narrative that we're waging a war against Islam, and that we are actually giving them more fodder for recruiting and radicalizing Muslims, not just in that part of the world, but in other parts of the world. And if we're concerned about potential terrorism here in the U.S., the most recent ones have not been from people who have necessarily gone overseas, trained, and come back. They're people who've become radicalized by events in other parts of the world. So, General, if we can't win for whatever reason, are we actually causing ourselves more harm than good by trying to stay the course?
Thank you. Josh? Over here.
Thank you, Josh Rogan, Washington Post. One of the options before the president recently was one put forward by Eric Prince, former White House Chief Status Steve Bannon. We can laugh, but my own reporting showed that the president considered this seriously. All right, and he met with senators, and there was a lot of push for a scheme by which he would draw down the U.S. troop presence to minuscule levels, put in thousands of contractors on a long-term basis, hand those contractors, broad powers under a viceroy, and that would be accompanied by a decentralization of Afghan political power out of Kabul. It was a whole, presentation, okay? And, yes, the president didn't choose this, but as Paul pointed out, he's got a lot of time left. And we could see a scenario in a couple of years where he does a rethink, and this will be back on the table. And, again, in a normal environment, this would seem like something that wouldn't happen, but we know that the president is interested in this idea, so I'm wondering if I could have your expert analysis on the viability and wisdom of this. Thank you.
Jeffrey Kemp here at the center. Just a historical footnote from all 4 of you. To what extent did the war in Iraq and the extraordinary absorption of American money and equipment and manpower detract from us winning in Afghanistan, particularly in those early years?
That's right.
Thanks. Yeah, the last one. Yes, please.
It seems, John, what you were saying If the most successful enterprises are ones that have sustained American military presence, do you see ultimately the establishment of a permanent military base in Afghanistan, and how, if so, might that excuse me, affect the entire region?
Thank you. So we'll start in reverse. Tom, you go first.
Yeah.
And then John, and last word to Jim.
I'll be very brief.
Please.
I mean, it was good to hear my fellow panelists say that Russia ought to be engaged in some way in the overall negotiations, that they're a player in the region. But I think as the discussion here has demonstrated, Russia's not really on our mind when we think about Afghanistan. And there's probably very good reasons why that is the case. It won't go down well in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. John?
I could not agree with you more that we are using the wrong language in articulating the issues associated with what I will call Salafi jihadi extremism as opposed to radical Islamic terrorism. We can't set ourselves up as a nation at being in a state of war with Islam. First of all, we're not, and we shouldn't be. And it's a sense of Islam and its place in the world today means this is a great opportunity for America to partner with them. But when we use the words like obliterate and eradicate from the face of the earth and mobilizing the civilized nations, which I'm going back to the inaugural address, in order to eradicate radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth, I'm not sure I want to be in the club called civilized nations if the United States is leading that in a war against Islam. I couldn't agree with you more, and we got to be careful about our terms here. And my guess would be that once again, if our commanders were in this room about how we define success, they probably are not going to use the words like obliterate and eradicate. So I'm not going to cross swords with the president over his terminology. I'll just simply tell you, like you, I agree it's counterproductive, frankly. Number two, I remember Blackwater in Iraq. I don't want to see Blackwater 2 in Afghanistan, frankly, and America does not have a tradition of dealing with mercs, and I think we probably need to continue that tradition. And I don't think there was a very interesting moment when we began our conversation with the Afghans on the bilateral security arrangement. And the lead Afghan authority, the leading Afghan delegation, the head of the delegation, said something I thought was really important, really monumental in my mind. Something to the effect of, and I'm probably horrible in my paraphrasing, for 1,000 years we, the Afghans, have thrown the enemies out. For the first time in our history, we're asking someone to stay. And we always said in the process that the United States does not seek bases. We may seek a presence over time, but that presence would not be a unilateral presence. It would be a presence that the Afghans, to which they would agree, and the form that it would take and the location of that presence, whether it's in one spot or many places around Afghanistan, that would be a decision ultimately to be made by the sovereign government of Afghanistan, and it would be made with us. But we, to my knowledge, we didn't profess the desire to have a base in Afghanistan. What we intended to do ultimately was to have that sufficient presence in Afghanistan to accomplish the mission. It's a nuance, but it's a big difference, frankly, between the two. And there are lots of places in the world where we've promised our friends that we would maintain a presence, but we wouldn't maintain a base. A base has an issue of sovereignty. A base creates local, national, and regional antibodies. And I think we need to be extraordinarily sensitive to that. We've created a lot of antibodies against American bases around the world. I think it's a smart thing for us to do to obviously remain in close consultation with the Afghans. And over time, if we accomplish the objectives of the president in the context of what he seeks to ultimately create in terms of the conditions for us to depart, then some small presence might be useful over time, but I don't think that we're in a position in the United States to want a base in Afghanistan, probably a presence in the short term.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Jim?
Well, first to Josh's question. I mean, first of all, the Afghan government isn't going to accept a viceroy, and they're not going to accept a mercenary force. Secondly, our allies wouldn't remain under those conditions.
That's right. Exactly.
And so you'd lose 5,000 or 6,000 allied troops, which are a pretty essential part of the overall security structure. Now, we do have thousands of armed contractors in Afghanistan, and they're providing static security for both U.S. military and State Department facilities. So it's not that you can't have contractors, but they have to be in a hierarchy under clear U.S. government authority, under international law, and responsive. And so I think it's a non-starter. Now, a lot of the questions here today have been questions that are kind of versions of what General Petraeus famously said in the early days of Iraq. Tell me how this ends. And we haven't been able to tell you how it ends. The choice that President Trump faced was a stark one. It was a choice between losing and not losing. Those were his only options. There was no third option. He could lose slowly by not doing anything and just staying where we were. He could lose quickly by pulling out, or he could not lose by modestly reinforcing in order to establish a stalemate. Those were the only choices. Those are the only choices. Now, maybe some further choice will open up in the future as the result of this, and we can hope for that. We can plan for that, but we can't count on it on any particular timescale.
Well, thank you to all of you, and especially thank you to Jim, John, and Tom. A great panel. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Great job. Great job.
Nicely done.
As usual.